But welcome for each and every one of you. I am excited every time we do a call here on Wednesday. We learn so much, and we want to learn about our health, learn about what does the science really say, because there's so much information out there. Now, years ago, we did hear from, so many articles and doctors that just talked about a gut-brain connection and how important the gut is. And actually, I've done some interviews before where I've heard things like, do you know that your gut is actually developed in the womb before your brain? Or that the gut is actually more of a control center for all of your health. Or you've heard a lot of information. Plus, I have been reading from our guest speaker on many of his books here in regards to the importance of health. I know he's very into all, he says he nerds for us so that we don't have to in regards to our health. If you look at who he is the former senior scientific advisor to the UK government's Committee on the Safety of Medicines, the chair of the Forum on Food and Health of the Royal Society of Medicine, and fellow of the Institute of Food, Brain Behavior of Oxford. And yet he is the one who has coined this pharmaconutrition about let your food be your pharmaconutrition. So we have somebody here who have been really spending most of his life finding out about health for us so that we don't have to guess about things, that we can find out what the science is really saying about our health and how important gut health really is. So please help me welcome on here our scientific advisor from Zeno, Dr. Paul Clayton. Hello, Paul. We're going to need to have you unmute.
Okay. Do we have sound?
There we go. We sure do. Thank you, Paul. And welcome. Okay. We are always so honored to have you each and every time that you take time out of your busy schedule to come on and educate us. Thank you so much for that.
No, thank you and welcome to all of your audience. It's always amazing to see so many people joining in these discussions. Pharmaconutrition, it was a term I invented a generation ago. 25 years ago, 30 years ago. And at that time, nobody knew what it meant. I'm not sure many people quite know what it means now. That book is available, I think, in over 50 languages, but I originally was going to call it Doctors, Diet, and Death. But my publisher said, no, we need to have something more upbeat. So the book.
I heard you say too on one of these books too that you were thinking of calling it like Nutrition for Dummies, and you're like, yeah, that one's not too good either. But you always come up with some great ideas of that.
Well, but I consider myself a dummy when it comes to life science. It is so breathtakingly complex, and the deeper you dive into it, the more you realize there are layers and layers of complex systems that you never get to the end of it. It's been humbling experience when you understand how people say it's impossible for a bumblebee to fly. To me, it seems almost impossible that a cell could be so self-organizing that it could even function, let alone the constellation of all the cells, the ecosystem that constitutes a human being. The fact that we can walk, talk, and think is something I can't comprehend. I don't understand how we can do those things. Somehow we manage. But the more I've gone into this, the more I've realized that we're in very dangerous territory. We have created an environment for ourselves. We've been seduced into living a lifestyle that is actually extremely harmful for us and is damaging not only us, the consumers, the people who are living at this time, but it's damaging those children who have not yet been born. This is known as the DOHAD, or the dietary origin hypothesis of disease, Barker's hypothesis. It has different names. And there's a lot of evidence that the generations that are coming after us are being progressively more damaged by the diet and lifestyle that we've chosen for ourselves, or rather that has been imposed on us. And at a certain point, it became a moral duty to leave academia behind. I mean, I still have a foot in academia, and actually move out into the real world and try and explain to people, there's a problem going on, the house is on fire, maybe we should start thinking about finding ways of putting it out.
Paul, that makes so much sense. I've heard, I did an interview here last week, which was also really powerful, with Stuart Tomk, who was a global educator about things, and
Right.
went around and he said, after all his years of experience, he came to Cincinnati, and when he met you, he said he became the student. Now, we all are students of yours and following, and I love what you're saying is actually you are out there learning also, or wanting to be able to help us, somebody who doesn't have that medical background, really understand how important it is or what we can be doing for our health. Because there's a lot of information out there, Paul. And as you know, we know more about health than we've ever known. And yet, Paul, people are still getting sicker. People have diagnosis upon diagnosis. And I've heard you say that so much of it is actually stemming from gut health.
I won't say that the gut is the cause, or the malfunctioning of the gut, or the malpopulation of the gut. It's not the root of all evil. But, when Hippocrates, the big man in medicine, said that all diseases started in the gut, he was more right than wrong. Yeah, it's one of the places where many disease conditions start. Now, it's not the only way that the modern diet and lifestyle make us sick. People, I'm sure, are aware of. Some of you have heard me talk about chronic inflammatory stress, and that's also very substantially to blame for the pandemics of chronic degenerative disease that disfigure the public health landscape today. And there's one or two other factors going on there as well. But dysbiosis, which is the malpopulation, the wrong population of microbes in the intestine, and all the problems that follow on from that, is a hugely important factor that fills the clinics, the hospitals, and provides grist to the mill of the pharmaceutical industry that poisons so many of us. There are very basic things, very simple things we can do to improve the situation, to restore or to move us back into the paths, I won't say of righteousness, that's a tall order, but certainly in terms of better metabolic and then clinical health. And these are easy steps to take. And I'm very happy to try and pass that information on.
Okay, well, we're all ears to hear about not only the importance of gut health, but what we can do to improve it and to help others with it. So I'm going to give the word to you. I know you've got some slides you're going to be sharing, and you should have access to do so.
All right, thank you. Let me see if I can share the screen in that case. I'll start with some slides, but don't worry, I'll get through them as quickly as I can, and then we'll be able to get to questions and answers. So at this point, here we
And
go.
while he's putting up his slides here, if you do have questions, remember, we can't just talk about treating or curing specific disease, but if you do have questions, please put them in the chat. We will try to be able to gather them or answer some of them after the slides. So there you go, Paul.
Okay, there was a lot to talk about when it comes to gut function, how it's gone wrong and how we can improve it. And we couldn't cover that in an hour-long presentation. We couldn't even cover it in the course of a day. There is so much material and it's so complicated. So I'm going to give a kind of a 20,000-foot view today, and I'm going to restrict the discussion to a small subset of topics. And it starts with gut-brain. I'll talk a little bit about that. You mentioned it yourself. Everybody knows about the gut-brain connection. But what has become apparent over the last 20 years or so of research is actually that the gut-brain connection is only one of many, because the gut very clearly connects to almost every other system that you can think of. So there is definitely a gut-heart connection. There's a gut-placenta connection, the liver, to your skin, to your gender. So a lot of sexuality and gender-related issues are affected by what's going on in the gut. And the immune system, I mean, this is not a comprehensive list. The gut is very clearly, very closely connected to the musculoskeletal system as well. I could go on, but the main point I want to make is that unlike the systems that we were taught at school, we were taught that you had the cardiovascular system, the genitourinary system, central nervous system. We were taught them in separate silos. It turns out that everything connects. And I'm going to quote Ernst Haeckel here, and he was a 19th century German biologist, a very famous figure in his day. And he said very famously, alles verbindet. And for those of you who are German speakers, that simply means everything connects. He was absolutely right then. And his concept, and this is a concept which Hippocrates would have been very familiar with, and Claude Bernard and Walter Cannon. Some of you who have a medical background will know these very famous medical and scientific figures I'm referring to would all agree everything connects. It all joins together. So this idea that disease begins in the gut, well, does it? Does all disease begin in the gut? I'm going to say yes and no. And I'm going to start off by talking about the enormous genetic and metabolic diversity of the microbiota. And we think of ourselves as primus inter pares, but when you really drill down, what you find is that we are more microbes than man, or humans. I want to be inclusive, but microbes and man is euphonious. So we contain approximately maybe 24,000 genes. But if you look at the genetic capacity of the microbiota, the microbiome, which is the genetic profile of the different microbial species that inhabit you, there's over 12 million of those. So there's a lot more of them than there are of us. There's a lot more metabolic and genetic diversity amongst our microbial inhabitants than we contain. And what this means is because they have so many more genes than we have, that the metabolic reactions that are catalyzed by all the microbes in and on us is very, very significant. And it's well over, and I can't really put a detailed figure on this, but it's well over 50% of the metabolome, which is the totality of the metabolic reactions that are taking place in our space. What that means is that there are many possible interactions between what these microbes are doing and how we get on. And we know that having a healthy microbiota, the right species, the metabolites they produce, the substrates they consume, really important for our health. But because there are so many of these, we have to find a way to wall off the microbes and all the metabolic sequences that they are driving. We have to keep them separate from ourselves. And that is why you have a barrier function in the intestine, in the colon in particular, because the colon contains the largest subset of the microbiota. That's where most of the microbes in your body live. Now, by all means, not all of them. There is a microbial population in every single tissue. No part of you is sterile. So your blood system in health and in disease has its own microbiota. The placenta does, the brain does. Every tissue has its own microbiota in health. And once there is disease in one of those organs, it may result in a different microbiota, and the changes in the microbiota might then contribute to the development of the disease. So this interaction that we have with microbes is very intimate, very important. But in the gut, which is where most of them are, you need to wall them off. We have to be very specific about which metabolites, which metabolic metabolites we allow entry into our body and which we reject. So this is known as colonic epithelial barrier function. It is a function of the cells that line the gut. They have the capacity, the capability, they're designed to allow into the blood system, into us, only those metabolites which we find useful, and to seal off those ones which might be harmful. But in order to maintain that barrier function, you need to have the right population of microbes in the intestine and in the diet. And in order to maintain a healthy population, which in its overall impact on our health is equally positive, you have to consume prebiotic fibers. Now, these are carbohydrates, but they're carbohydrates that we cannot digest. They're not fuel for us, at least not directly. They're fuel for what we call saccharolytic bacteria. That simply means bacteria that are able to break down starches and these carbohydrates, I should say, which is what these prebiotic fibers are, indigestible carbohydrates. And they are essential in maintaining this barrier, this epithelial barrier in the gut. And that in turn is very important in maintaining a healthy metabolism for us, that is outside the gut, but in the rest of the body, and healthy microbial populations in all the rest of our tissues. If you don't feed the right bacteria, if they're replaced by unhealthy bacteria, if you don't have enough prebiotic fiber in your diet, your health suffers. And it suffers in many, many different ways. One of the biggest studies was done. It was a WHO-funded study carried out in 2019. WHO has been rather discredited of late. But many of the scientists who've worked for the WHO are people I have a high regard for. This study was done by a very good group of scientists, at least one of whom I know personally. And they churned the numbers, including, very, very big numbers indeed, and they came to the conclusion that those people who had a higher intake of fibers, the incidence of early death, which basically means preventable death, was reduced by almost a third, which is hugely significant. There is no drug that can do that. All the drugs that we have access to can't do that. And when you break down the form of protection that you get by eating more fiber, you can see here a 25% reduction in bowel cancer, a 20% reduction in breast cancer, which I'll talk about later, and significant protection against heart attacks and strokes. So you're protecting against various cancers through different mechanisms, and we can talk about that. You're protecting the cardiovascular system. And more recently, other studies have come out which show conclusively that you're protecting the brain in different ways. So a 25% reduction in the risk of dementia. And NAFLD, which we now know as MAFLD, which is basically non-alcohol related fatty liver disease, now known as metabolic abnormality associated, dysregulation associated fatty liver disease. It's a less pejorative term, which currently affects between 40 and 45% of the entire world's population, because the global diet is far more depleted in fiber than it ever used to be. So the liver is also highly protected by increasing your intake of fibers, and prebiotic fibers are a very large part of that. We'll talk about that too. There is good data also which indicates that a diet which contains more fibers, and especially more prebiotic fibers, protects against Parkinsonism and may be able to reduce and reverse early Parkinsonism. We know that if you have the wrong bacteria in the gut, including species such as the D. vibrio bacteria, what these bacteria do, they get a lot of their energy from reducing dietary sulfates to sulfide. And they produce hydrogen sulfide in the gut, which is not only extremely toxic and corrosive, it's cytotoxic, it's also a grade 1 carcinogen. And so you begin to see why reducing fiber in the diet might create problems. Increasing the fiber increases the good bacteria and depresses the numbers of these very pathogenic microbes. And then very recently, just actually 6 weeks ago, another study which looked at fiber intakes to see whether they were associated with healthy aging. And you can already tell that from the WHO study. Higher fiber intakes reduce early death. Therefore, by definition, they're increasing your chances of arriving at a late old age in good health. And this subsequent study, this very recent study, really supports the original WHO data. If you want to stay healthier for longer, increase your intake of fibers. And I would agree with that wholeheartedly. So what are the prebiotic fibers for? Well, they feed the saccharolytic bacteria, the bacteria that like to eat these particular digestion-resistant carbohydrates, and some of them are very well known. The lactobacilli and bifidobacteria, these are the types of bacteria that you find in yogurts and in some probiotic supplements, which frankly are not worth taking. They don't achieve much because they don't take, because of something known as colonization resistance. I'm just listing these bacteria here to say that fundamentally they're healthy, but they're not particularly useful if you take them in your food. You need something else in order to get the mass changes in the microbiota in the gut and subsequently in other tissues, which will support good health. But The lactobacilli and the bifidobacteria are not the only bacterial species that like to eat these prebiotic fibers. And here's a whole bunch more. And you don't see venom in many yogurts or kefir drinks or in supplements, but all of them are important. All of them are associated with positive health outcomes. All of them like to consume these prebiotic fibers in a reaction that is technically a fermentation reaction. And they break them down not into sugars, which is what we do when we digest carbohydrates. The bacteria break these prebiotic fibers down into short-chain fatty acids, which are extremely healthy for us. And they also produce a wide range of other compounds, which are known as bacteriocins. They do, amongst other things, they fight the probiotic species corner in the gut, and they kill off and thin out the numbers of unhealthy bacteria. And they produce various compounds which improve various aspects of immune function, of cardiovascular health. These are all extraordinarily positive outcomes. These are good bacteria to have, and these are good bacteria to support. And in order to help them multiply, as I said, taking yogurts or supplements doesn't work. What you have to do is to eat more prebiotic fibers, which always used to be in our diets in large amounts. Now, if you eat these prebiotic fibers, they pass through the small intestine unaffected. They're in the lumen of the gut. And so the bacteria that like to eat them move into the lumen to find their food source. They're those little green dots. They're probiotic species. And they're breaking down the prebiotic fibers into a whole array of metabolites. But perhaps amongst the more important ones are these short-chain fatty acids. I'll focus on butyrate. And what butyrate does, very interesting molecule, very simple molecule, but it is a powerful anti-inflammatory compound. So it reduces inflammation in the gut. But if you're eating large amounts of prebiotic fibers, which we used to do, you're producing so much butyrate in the gut that it is also affecting other tissues in the body, protecting, for example, the liver and the cardiovascular system. We don't eat enough fibers to have that effect. We don't even eat enough fibers to have a strong enough anti-inflammatory effect in the gut itself. And that's at the root of some of the major healthcare problems that we see in public health today. Now, butyrate has one other function. It is not only a powerful anti-inflammatory, it is also extremely good at killing off cancer cells or forcing them to stop multiplying or to commit suicide or to redifferentiate. And what that means is that the cancer cell becomes less like a cancer cell. It becomes more like the healthy cell, the normal cell that it used to be, and it stops growing, multiplying, and invading. So this is an entirely healthy ecosystem. You're eating the right fibers. They're encouraging the growth of the right bacteria in your colon. And these are now part of a healthy metabolism. They are supporting the health of the lining of your gut and every other tissue besides. The only problem is we're not eating enough of these fibers, and this is derived from different sources. We know that if you go back to the year 0 and you go back to before pre-Christian times, some very good quantitative archaeological work has been done there in Mesoamerica. That's the thin strip of land that joins North and South America. And cultures have been found who were consuming prebiotic fiber probably as the main dietary constituent. So about 135 grams of prebiotic fiber a day. This is based on an analysis of crop patterns, mills, ovens, and things like that. They were consuming, in other words, about maybe 20% of their daily calorific requirements in the forms of these fiber in these foods. So agave, which is a kind of a cactus, or a succulent at least, legumes, beans, peas, and lentils, maize, nopales, which are opuntia pods. And if you've been to Mexico, you've probably eaten this, or if you're from Mexico, you've eaten these. They don't have much taste, but you can spice them up. And these people were therefore producing a lot of interesting and very health-promoting compounds in their gut, including huge amounts of butyrate, which were damping inflammation in almost every tissue in the body, and which were killing off cancer cells everywhere. I think these people were probably highly protected. Now, they may not have smelt very good, because when you're producing that much butyrate, you smell, how can I put it, a little rancid. It really doesn't smell very good. And they're also producing large amounts of gas. So if you remember Blazing Saddles, that scene where the cowboys are all sitting around the campfire, I would imagine that those Oldham people, that's what they were called, must have been a bit like that. Were they healthy? I'm pretty certain they were, but we don't have access to their medical records. They didn't keep any. But what we do have are medical records from a more recent period, and this is England 1850 to 1900, which is known as the mid-Victorian period, a population which documented itself in exhaustive detail, and which I've researched and published on. They weren't consuming 135 grams of prebiotic fiber, but between 20 and 40 from different species, different foods. Helianthus tuberosus, which for those of you who don't know, this is Jerusalem artichoke, which is like a mutated potato. It's a tuber that contains large amounts of inulin. So they're eating a large amount of prebiotic fiber. And we have their medical records, and we know IBS is not recognized at that time. IBD is vanishingly rare. Colorectal cancer existed, but was so rare, less than 10% of the figures that we see today, and in fact so rare that doctors of the day, even without genetic analysis, could see how it was transferred from one generation to another. So if someone was unlucky enough to have a high risk denoting gene for colorectal cancer, they could see the same problems in the children and the grandchildren. Difficult to see that today without genetic analysis, because everybody gets colorectal cancer, and I'll show you some slides to support that rather contentious statement in a minute. These people were still eating a profoundly healthy diet, and they had very little cardiovascular disease and very little central nervous system disease as well. They were protected. So where are we now? Our intake of prebiotic fiber today is probably 3 to 4 grams. So since the Oldham folk in Mesoamerica, intakes have fallen from 135 to 30, still healthy, down to 3, which is manifestly not healthy. So traditionally, we've eaten huge amounts of prebiotic fiber, and that has supported the growth of saccharolytic species, the probiotic bacteria, and they have suppressed other bacteria which consume protein, which are not good for us. They're called proteolytic species. But post-transitional, that is, since we have moved to an ultra-processed diet, which contains very little prebiotic fiber as well, the saccharolytic bacteria, the ones that consume prebiotic fiber, the food they consume is no longer there. They die away. They're replaced by proteolytic or protein-consuming species, particularly in the last 2/3 of the colon. And many of these bacteria, and I'll come back to this, are gram-negative. And that's important because that's a factor in exacerbating chronic inflammatory stress. As we've changed our diet, and as the microbiota in our guts has changed, there has been a huge worsening of public health. We've seen a tenfold increase in non-communicable degenerative diseases, not just in the gut, but in all of our tissues. And we have to ask the question, is there a link? And I think there very clearly is. So this is the healthy gut, lots of prebiotic fiber, lots of saccharolytic bacteria producing butyrate and all the good compounds that we want. Now they've been starved to death, they've died off, they've been replaced by these red blots, which represent protein-consuming bacteria. There's no prebiotic fiber. The protein-consuming species take over. And where do they get their protein from? Not from our diet. The protein we eat is digested and absorbed in the small intestine. So these proteolytic species consume mucin proteins. Those are the proteins that make up the mucus layer. And you can see there, those are the top sort of pale cream yellow layers that normally lay over the colonocytes. Those are the cells at the bottom, and protect them. So these proteolytic species consume and corrode the mucus layer, and they come into direct contact with our cells. And because they're gram-negative, many of them, which means they're coated with lipopolysaccharides, they're profoundly pro-inflammatory. Now you have inflammation in the lining of the gut, and you're moving towards IBS, or you're moving further towards IBD, or you're moving further towards colorectal cancer. And the tight cell junctions, that barrier, the colonic epithelial barrier, the protective barrier that I mentioned when we started, starts to break down. because the cells start to move physically apart. They're actually dying. They're hugely inflamed. The tight cell junctions open up, and toxic substances start to enter the blood. They get into the portal vein, move to the liver, cause inflammation in the liver, and are a very important contributory factor to the enormous increase in liver disease, fatty liver disease, that I mentioned earlier on. And by the way, if you continue eating the wrong kind of diet, that becomes a steatohepatitis, which is a scarring of the liver, and a stiffening of the extracellular matrix, which is a precancerous condition. And this is why we're seeing much more liver cancer as well. Other things, bad things happen as well, because if the epithelial barrier breaks down badly enough, not only do toxins get into the blood, such as lipopolysaccharide, but bacteria can get into the blood as well and cause subclinical infections in other tissues, many of which we're now beginning to realize are profoundly involved in the diseases that we used to call autoimmune diseases. So I'm going to talk about the way in which the microbiota, the good and the bad microbiota, affect three different systems. I'll talk about the digestive system, including the liver. I'll talk about the central nervous system, focusing mostly on the brain itself. And I'll talk about sex, because it turns out that what happens in the gut doesn't just remain in the gut. It most certainly affects gender and sex-related issues as well. So let's start with the gastrointestinal tract. And I'll start off with a little bit of epidemiology. IBS, which I mentioned before, isn't really recognized in the 19th century, now affects up to 14% of the population. And we know that inflammatory bowel disease is increasing almost everywhere. And in adults, it's certainly increasing in the newly industrialized countries, stabilized a little bit in the developed nations, possibly because just about everyone who is potentially going to go down that road has already gone there. But this is all, these canaries in the coal mine are all singing the same sad song. Small intestinal bacterial overgrowth is increasing as well. And there's a relationship here, because you don't really want too many of the wrong bacteria, or even too many of the right bacteria in the small intestine. What are the two major risk factors that increase the risk of SIBO? Well, one is if you take powerful antacids, the proton pump inhibitors, the acid in your stomach is there not really primarily for digestive purposes, it's part of your immune system. Part of the innate immune system. It's a physical barrier, and it's there to kill off microorganisms that you might ingest with your food or with your drink. If that barrier has gone, if the pH in the stomach has risen to or close to neutrality, then a lot of microorganisms, live microorganisms that you ingest, are not being killed off in the stomach. They're getting into the small intestine, where they may proliferate. Now you have SIBO. The other cause of SIBO is when the microbial contents of the large bowel move retrograde or backwards and enter the small intestine, which doesn't normally happen if the ileocecal valve is intact. However, if you have inflammatory bowel disease, and we see more and more of that, that can lead to scarring of the ileocecal valve, which then cannot function properly, so that when peristalsis is occurring in the large intestine, material in the large intestine, including microbes, some of it will be forced into the small intestine. Now you have SIBO. So because we have so many problems now with a hostile, unnatural, pathogenic microbiota in the large bowel, SIBO is increasing as well. And colorectal cancer is increasing, particularly in young adults, where since 1995, there has been almost a doubling. Now, I'll say right away, colorectal cancer in young people is not as common as it is in old people. But the fact that we've seen such a significant shift in such a short period of time is a red light to end all red lights. We are doing something very wrong indeed. And this is the same data in graphic form, just to show you how very alarming this change is. And it's not just colorectal cancer as well, appendiceal cancer as well. Now, again, I want to be very clear about this. This is not a particularly common cancer, but the frequency of cancer of the appendix has just been shooting up. And as you can see here, compared to the children that were born in 1945, a mere 40 years later, the frequency of appendiceal cancer has increased by 4 times. So more cases have been seen in 2023 than in the half century before that. So there's something very clearly very unhealthy going on here. And dysbiosis caused by a lack of prebiotic fiber is a #1 suspect in causing this transition. Fatty liver disease increased by 40% since 1985, and it continues to rise. And the data is starting to come in now. Prebiotic fibers are very obviously protective against colon cancer. We do not yet know whether they're protective against appendiceal cancer. That research has not yet been done, but it looks very much like it, starting from first principles. And there is actually data emerging to show that they are protective against the development of non-alcohol related fatty liver disease, or metabolic dysfunction associated fatty liver disease, as we now call it. So the relationship between prebiotic fibers, the right microbiota, and the health of the gut and associated tissues such as the liver is absolutely clear. Now let's move on to something that's a little bit less obvious. The gut-brain connection. Well, we think we know a little bit about that, but I'm going to talk about how that connection might actually take place. Now we know that the neurodevelopmental disorders are increasing in all the developed nations that we know of. So that includes not just ADD and ADHD, but also oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, dysphagia, dyspraxia, Aspie's. There's a lot of other conditions that are folded up into this group, including schizophrenia, which is now being regarded as a late onset neurodevelopmental disease, typically one that starts to emerge after puberty. All of these conditions are increasing. Is there a connection to prebiotic fibers? Well, I'm going to present some evidence to you that this indicates that that might well be the case. When we look at the risk factors that seem to predispose children towards developing one of the neurodevelopmental disorders, including schizophrenia, the risk factors that we know of include maternal obesity, and this is one of the reasons why we're seeing more children with these problems, because we are getting heavier. Type 2 diabetes, type 1 possibly, chronic infection and chronic stress, chronic inflammatory stress, and all of these are conditions that raise the levels of a number of inflammatory mediators in the body, of which interleukin-8 is one. Whether it's the most important one, I think it remains to be seen. But I think what this means is that in the womb, as the central nervous system develops, and it's an extraordinarily complex wiring system, the nerves, each when they first start out, have a blueprint which tells them where they have to go to, and they navigate down various chemical gradients until they get to the right place where they should be. And then the genetic information, the blueprint that each one of them carries, tells them to stop when they get to the right place and have made the right connections. These chemical gradients, and possibly electrical gradients as well, are very complex, and if they're being flooded with inflammatory mediators, that seems to have the ability to confuse the nerves, to prevent them from going to where they should go, making connections that they should. And this appears to be a significant factor in the development of a neurodevelopmental syndrome. Some preclinical work has gone into this. So if you're looking at rodent models and you take the pregnant maternal mouse or rat and expose them to a chronic inflammatory mediator such as interleukin-8, then you see in the next generation, you see, amongst other things, symptoms that look like neurodevelopmental disease, including schizophrenia in that next generation. We know that endotoxemia is a contributory factor. So if you have leaky gut, as it's known, and you have lipopolysaccharides from the gut moving into the bloodstream, damaging the liver, damaging the cardiovascular system, that creates chronic inflammation all over the place, including in the central nervous system. And if you're in the womb and your mother has endotoxemia, we have good reason to believe that that is going to interfere with the normal development of your circuits in your brain as you're growing and contribute or increase the risk of a neurodevelopmental disorder, which will manifest itself after birth. I cannot say hand on heart that prebiotic fibers will reduce the risk of all of these conditions, but there is good evidence that suggests that they will be protective, and in fact that they will be highly protective. So this is something I would recommend all mums and mums-to-be to take along with their folic acid supplements. There is a relationship with malfunctioning of the brain after birth as well. We know that the numbers of children presenting with depression and anxiety disorders has been increasing fairly steadily for the last 20, 25 years or so. And we're seeing more reports of chronic pain, certainly in adults and also very much in children. We're seeing more deaths of despair. We're seeing more patients progressing towards neurodegenerative disease and all kinds of other pathologies. And the microbiome, the microbiota seems to be involved here too. How does that work? Well, first of all, let me quickly take you through a kind of, let me parse pain for you. There's pain and pain and pain, at least three different types. That is neuropathic, which where there is nerve damage involved, nociceptive, where your pain receptors are being stimulated, and nociplastic, which is to do with excessive activity in the pain circuits in parts of the midbrain and parts of the cortices as well. When you have chronic inflammatory stress of a certain kind, this will create a kind of neuroinflammatory stress in those parts of the brain which act as an amplifier for sensations of pain that are being caused elsewhere. And we now know that the microbiota, if it's wrongly configured, if you have dysbiosis, it's pumping out a lot of chemical mediators which increase the intensity of all these different types of pain. And that seems to fit the increasing reports of adults and children who are presenting to the medical profession with chronic and pain that is difficult to manage. And it's one of the factors also that is probably driving the increasing numbers of people who are being addicted to pain pills and showing signs of addiction in general. If you have neuroinflammation, that actually lays the neuronal substrates for addictive behavior. So having the right microbiota, very important. Having the wrong microbiota is doing a lot of bad things to the way in which your brain functions. It's making life more painful, and it's making it more likely that you will become trapped in an addiction of sorts and possibly an addiction to analgesics. I'm very certain that the prebiotic fibers are protective against all of these conditions. There are very persuasive reports that they have therapeutic effects in depression and anxiety. And quite recently, we've seen a couple of papers coming out that indicate that they raise pain thresholds as well. So painful stimuli become less painful and easier to manage. Ultra-processed foods come in here, and I think while we're talking about the brain, we have to include these in the discussion. And the reason why I want to bring this up is something called the ELSA Brazil study. Now, the ELSA is an international study. Brazil is the Brazilian arm, and they were looking there at different cohorts of people who'd eaten more or less ultra-processed foods. Now, the more ultra-processed foods you're eating, by definition, the less prebiotic fibers you're containing, and the more unhealthy your microbiota is then going to be. And in those people who had the lowest amounts of fiber, there was a 25% faster rate of executive function decline, which means you become less able to make complex decisions, and cognition itself starts to run down. You move towards dementia that much more rapidly. Prebiotics are clearly effective. The people who ate the most fiber in their diets had the best preserved executive function and global cognition. And to support that claim, what we do know is that if you eat this ultra-processed diet that has almost no prebiotic fibers at all, you see a more rapid breakdown of the hippocampus. This is one of those structures in the midbrain where neurogenesis takes place throughout life. You're continually growing new brain cells, and they're populating different parts of the midbrain and the forebrain as well. So if you hammer the hippocampus, you're less able to repopulate the brain, different parts of the brain with new, healthy, functioning nerve cells, and the more likely you are to start to move down the road towards neurodegenerative disease and dementia. We see this commonly occurring in aged people in the developed countries who do not eat enough fiber, but we do not see it in people of the same age who do not eat an ultra-processed diet. And I'm referring here to vestigial groups, and many of you have heard me refer to these people before. They include the Hadza, the Tsimane, and of course the mid-Victorians. They ate plenty of prebiotic fiber. They did not develop hippocampal atrophy as they got older. They did not become demented as they got older. We do. They didn't. They ate far more fiber than we did. And one of the reasons why we think this might be occurring is the brain, 20% of it by weight is extracellular matrix. This is the internal, this provides the internal structure of the brain. If you have chronic inflammation, that matrix begins to break down. The internal organization and architecture of the brain breaks down. And if you have chronic inflammatory stress as well, the nerves can't make synapses and form contacts anymore, and they start dying back. So for all of these reasons, a diet that is pro-inflammatory, and if you have a breakdown of colonic barrier epithelium, you are going to have chronic inflammation. That's going to cause, over time, increased brain damage. Prebiotics will be protective. I have no doubt about that. Now, the perennial topic, sex and gender. How do prebiotic fibers play into this? Well, I'm going to talk about 5 subheadings: polycystic ovary syndrome, toxic preeclampsia, infertility and gender dysphoria. We'll talk about sperm counts, and we'll talk about endocrinology. And I'll show you how that all fits together. Now, the polycystic ovary syndrome, it's been very closely linked to dysbiosis. This idea has been around for over a decade now. Tremelin et al., an Australian group, who did the original research, and they more or less worked out how it goes. If you have a breakdown of colonic barrier epithelial function, lipopolysaccharides are moving into the bloodstream, you have lots of inflammation, damage to insulin receptors, and that leads fairly directly to a disruption of follicles in the ovary. And since that first paper was published, other groups of scientists have worked with animal models, and they've worked with human beings, and all the emerging data supports Tremelin's original work. And just to prove the point, recent work indicates that if you eat more prebiotic fibers, you reduce the symptoms of polycystic ovary syndromes. And it's a lot safer doing it this way than by using the rather barbaric endocrine disrupting drugs that the medical profession currently relies on. Spermatogenesis comes in here as well. This is one of the reasons, I'm pretty certain, why sperm counts have been falling so catastrophically ever since 1970. The testes, which is where the sperm are formed, are undoubtedly affected by endotoxemia and by chronic inflammatory stress. When there is excessive inflammatory stress in the testes, the formation of sperm cannot take place, so this would explain the falling sperm counts. And of course, the other function of the testicles is to produce testosterone, and this explains very neatly why testosterone levels have been falling as well over the same period of time. And this is one of the reasons for the increasing incidence of gender dysphoria. Not the only reason, let's not be reductionist about it, but it would be ridiculous to assert that changing testosterone levels, falling in men and rising in women because of polycystic ovary syndrome, it would be ridiculous to assert that these endocrine changes have not contributed to the increasing incidence of gender dysphoria. Yep, so the blood barrier around the testes and the ovary is damaged by chronic inflammation, by hyperglycemia. We don't have to get into the weeds on this, but I just want to make the point that prebiotics are almost certainly protective in terms of protecting the testes and their function, and the ovaries as well. That's not the whole story, though. We know that in polycystic ovary syndrome, you have an elevation of testosterone. How could that work? Well, the bacteria in the gut and the prebiotic fibers you eat are definitely part of this, because we know that the fibers that you eat affect what is known as the estrobolome. That is the totality of bacteria in the gut that metabolize estrogen. So when you make estrogen, part of it is metabolized, it passes into the gut. You form estrogen composites, they're conjugates, really, if you're familiar with that term. And there are some bacteria in the gut bacteria that are not particularly healthy, that produce an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase. If your gut is full of these bacteria, which it will be if you don't eat prebiotic fiber, the beta-glucuronidase breaks down the estrogen conjugates, so you then reabsorb more of it. Estrogen levels go up, and this has now been linked to accelerated puberty and breast cancer, and neither of these is desirable. And the evidence that we have shows very clearly that if you eat more prebiotic fibers, they're improving the quality of the microbiota in the gut. You have less glucuronidase being formed, less of the estrogen metabolites are being broken down and reabsorbed, and this is highly protective. So this is another reason to increase your intake of prebiotic fibers. And when you do that, you change this unhealthy, disease-causing microbiome, you bring it back to normality. This was the traditional microbiota, and the population of microbes inside your gut is once more, it's not harming you, but it's helping you as it was originally designed to do. These are the prebiotic fibers we use. This is a very short fiber called FOS. Reacts very quickly. You can't use too much. So we add more of a longer fiber called inulin, same molecule, but in longer, so it metabolizes more slowly. We can get those from endive, that's one, or chicory root. This is something we get from oats. It's a longer fiber, more complex again. You can get this from green banana. We put them all together in the right proportions, because when you eat this blend of prebiotic fibers, the FOS works first, and it starts this shift away from bad bacteria to the good ones in the ascending colon. And then the progressively longer fibers start coming on board a little bit later on, further down the colon, acting like a relay team. And in this way, you transform the microbiota of the whole intestine. It isn't just prebiotic fiber. We know of a number of other dietary compounds that also modify the microbiota. The polyphenols clearly do. And we know that the omega-3s do as well. And we include all of these in the health protocol as well. The combination is designed to restore a healthy microbiota. So we start off with this, but the totality also includes balanced soil and extend, which also contains polyphenols. This is a package designed to do many things, but one of the things that it does is to restore a healthy microbiota with all the health benefits that will then ensue, not just for you, but for your children. So let me end this structured part of the discussion. And Carla, I don't know how much time we have left.
We don't have a lot of time, but that's okay. I've gathered a couple questions that I think are important.
Okay.
Dr. Paul, it's absolutely incredible to hear how many things and many problems that people can have from having dysbiosis in the gut, and how important it really is to be proactive on this. So one of the things people were asking is, when it's so important, can we eat our way? Can we do something? Where are the prebiotic fibers in our food? So what can they be doing to do that? Or, I mean, is this enough? We take this.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's been designed by me very carefully to provide all the prebiotic fibers that we know are linked to better health. But if you want to do it,
but just a sec now, because I know before you have said things like, if we could eat our way to health, more than taking any, because I know you don't even like the word supplements. We're not going to call these supplements. This is food. But if people could eat their way to it, what would they be eating?
well, I was just getting to that when you so rudely interrupted me. I was.
I don't want to do that, Dr. Paul.
Yeah, no. What I was going to suggest was Helianthus tuberosus.
Okay, you're fun. You're fun. What is all that?
I already told you, Carla, how soon they forget. You're a terrible student. This is the Jerusalem artichoke. And you can grow them
Oh,
yourself. All you have to do is to plant one tuber and it will do the rest itself. They grow like weeds and they're delicious. So they're at least tubers. They spread, they'll take over the whole flower bed if you're not careful. And you dig them up, they're a little bit like potatoes. You boil them and then you peel them. They'll peel very easily once they're boiled, and you mash them up and you add a little butter and maybe salt and pepper to taste and possibly just a pinch of nutmeg. You can get really creative and they're delicious. I love them. And they're a
okay.
fantastic source of fiber.
Well, that's one way of getting it, but that sounds like a lot of work for some people. So this is a better idea. Now, question on this is people are asking of how much to be taking. Can you take, what do you do for adults? What do you do for children? Could you maybe talk a little bit about taking
Sure.
it?
Okay, well, based on all of the available data, I would say that for an adult, the optimal dose would be maybe 2 scoops, one in the morning, one at night. People find it easier rather than taking them all at once. For a child of less than 45 kilos or less, probably a single scoop, again, divided into 2 doses. I mean, if you have a healthy microbiota, which I think when I started taking this, I already did because I used to eat a lot of foods which contained prebiotic fibers anyway. So typically beans and pulses. So I just went straight on to 2 scoops of that a day and I didn't have any problems with it at all. People who've eaten a terrible diet with very little prebiotic fiber, who have, as a result, an unhealthy microbiota, you start taking huge amounts of fiber and it's civil war down there. The different microbial species are all fighting against each other, and you're going to have bloating and distension and maybe, diarrhea, could be all kinds of problems. So if you're starting from a bad place, ease into it. If you already have a healthy diet with lots of dietary fiber, then you can start off with a big diet without a problem, with a big dose, with no problem.
So many times I've noticed that so many people, they do have issues from the start. So I'm recommending everybody, whether I don't know who's healthy, you can't see on people if they're healthy, right? You don't know. You don't see who has cancer or not either. So I kind of like the idea of having this, you know, uh, so that people can all start on a small amount. Would that be okay?
Sure, sure. Yeah.
Okay, so how about fasting? Is fasting something that's important?
Hmm. Um, I think that fasting is a good idea if you have weight issues or if you have glycemic control issues. By moving to intermittent fasting or towards a low glycemic diet or ketogenic diet, you will you may well experience health benefits. It may well help with weight loss. I don't recommend ketogenic diets long term because when the people who advocate them say you don't eat any carbs at all, they tend to cut out all carbs, which include not just the digestible ones, which are glycemic, but they also have a tendency to include the prebiotic fibers as well because they're carbs. Now, they're not glycemic. When you eat these prebiotic fibers, they don't affect your blood sugar at all because they're not broken down into glucose. You don't digest them. They're broken down into short chain fatty acids. Well, which is why they don't have a very high calorie content. The microbes get most of the calories, about half of them. So where carbs are, I don't know, it could be hovering around 4 calories a gram. If you eat the carbs as prebiotic fiber, the bacteria get about half of that, and the fatty acids that these carbs produce are only mean that the prebiotic fiber weighs in at about 2 calories a gram.
Okay, so just I have two more questions. And I know that it's getting over time here. But if people are having issues, sometimes I've know you said like SIBO, sometimes those type of things can be affected in the gut. Like what else? Is there things that can be affected maybe by does prebiotic and SIBO go together? Or what about
No,
parasites? All of that kind of ties
no.
together. What about parasites?
If you have SIBO, you can't eat zinobiotic. If you have SIBO, you will be either on a FODMAP diet or you'll be avoiding these types of fibers. So the thing to do would be to treat the SIBO first, and once that's been rectified, then you can start to use the zinobiotic. However, if you do have SIBO, you probably have one of the risk factors I talked about. You're using proton pump inhibitors, to reduce stomach acid, or you have already had inflammatory bowel disease and damage to the ileocecal valve. If the problem was the proton pump inhibitors, well, stop taking those and move on to something else, such as the gastric raft technology. If, however, the ileocecal valve has been damaged, you can clear the bacteria out of the small intestine, but eventually they will come back, and then you'll have to treat the SIBO all over again. So that is an issue. Parasites is a different question. This is not a cure for parasites at all. There are so many different types of parasites. We actually have quite good anti-parasitic drugs, ivermectin, mebendazole. These are both drugs that have a high therapeutic index and many different applications. And a lot of people find them very useful.
Okay. Well, so much information here, Dr. Paul. We are so appreciative. So I think everybody will understand by the end of this in detail. And I know you said get it down to a level where we all can understand. And some of it, like you said, not always the best doing because it's over my head sometimes, Dr. Paul. But I did get all of the importance of making sure that we are doing what we can. And I'm so glad that you nerd in it so that the rest of us don't have to. And not only by getting these, because I've heard you say so many times, this has been something that you have been proud to be able to formulate, to have so many different prebiotic fibers in there that is feeding all the good bacteria in there and strengthening it. But how the health protocol, Zinzino's health protocol, it works, they all work together. And it all is actually working to help your gut, but it's actually important for your brain, important for your skin. I know anti-aging, all of that all ties together with all of this. So
we didn't have time to get into that, but yes, the microbiota in the gut have a definite effect on the population of microbes on the skin, and they do affect skin appearance and aging. And we didn't have time really to talk about the way in which the microbiota affect the integrity of your skeletal system. That's really important as well. It's a nest of connections and interactivity. I just picked on a couple of topics, and maybe we can come back to this in a couple of months' time, and we'll talk about some of the other connections.
Let's do that because there's so much involved here. Well, Dr. Paul, we want to thank you so much for your time. We're so appreciative of you working, formulating things in Zinzino. And I know we've got some exciting news for people coming up that we're working on to also in regards to testing and in regards to getting that gut tested. But that will come when we get closer to it. So we won't talk about it yet, right? But we're excited about that.
Very.
Okay, well, we'll do that in a couple months when it is all official and we have that out too. But thank you all for being on, and thank you, Dr. Paul, for your time. So appreciate everybody, and we'll see you next week.
You're very welcome. Until next time.